Shabbat Shalom. On so many Shabbatot recently, we've acknowledged that we really are ready for the week to end. That's been true for a while, and all the more so as we live through the denouement of an election that feels like it's lasted for 4 years. This week was an emotional roller coaster, especially on Wednesday, as the relief of the Senate races ending was soon overshadowed by the chaos at the Capitol building and on the streets of Washington. I won't revisit every detail of extremists interrupting congressional proceedings or white supremacists wielding guns and Confederate flags throughout the temple of our democracy. You saw the videos, you read the articles. But as we yearn for a taste of the world to come on this Shabbat, it's hard to avoid the bitter taste of the world as it has been. This past week and the past 4 years, and the ways in which the past 4 years led to this past week have all been unavoidable. Tonight, I'm remembering where we were as a community exactly 4 years ago this Shabbat, returning to Parashat Shmot, the beginning of Exodus, our story of enslavement and liberation. As our text drew us back to Egypt that evening, our services, you may recall in 2017, were held in the rotunda in anticipation of a big crowd before the Women's March that following day. Some of us were exhausted, some of us were ebullient, some had just sipped bourbon before taking a prayer book, and a few were wearing pink knitted hats that you may remember from that time. We heard the words of the Parsha. A new king arose over Egypt with a knot in our stomachs, an unwelcome example of Torah unfolding before our eyes. We didn't know precisely what would happen after President Trump's inauguration, but we knew enough in that moment 4 years ago for almost every person in the room to see connections between the Torah text and our reality. The prospect of a ruler like we'd never seen before in this country, with seemingly little regard for democratic institutions. That was the beginning of the past 4 years. And if you remember, many of us wondered if his transition out of office might not be peaceful. Since then, we've spoken about that possibility, we've prepared mentally for it, we've read articles prognosticating about how it would all unfold. And this week, we saw a version of what we knew was possible. But I want to encourage us also to see what we've learned since then. After a week that was scary and infuriating, at the very least this Shabbat, we can reflect on who we've become in the past 4 years, and to have hope that this crucible into which we were thrust has forged an identity that will get us through this moment, and hopefully to a much better world to come. As a community, we've maintained our devotion to a text that teaches us to resist pharaohs, to play the long game in the desert, and to stay resilient in moments that feel dark. We've had resolve, as demonstrated by our renewed commitment to organizing in anti-racism and advocating for democracy. And we've had each other. Over the past 4 years, these things have prepared us to tackle what comes next. Even if the impulse toward authoritarianism grew stronger, so did we. The work of repairing our country extends far beyond inaugurating a new president in a week and a few days. But we've learned over the past 4 years that we are capable of building something new. The Israelites were in Egypt for far longer than 4 years. In fact, they were there for 400 years. And the Midrash teaches that while they were there, they held on to 3 primary things that sustained them as a people: their language, their dress, and their names. This text is often used as a rationale for why it's good to maintain tradition, but unpacking each of these discrete things, we get a glimpse of some of what we've done as a community as we've endured the past 4 years together. You might assume that the language of the Israelites refers to Hebrew, but many commentaries connect language here to Lashon Hara, evil speech. While in Egypt, the Israelites did not allow themselves to fall into the ethical morass of their society, opting instead to uphold values of truth and perhaps kindness in their words. Maintaining a distinct way of dressing made them visibly different from their Egyptian oppressors, allowing them to see who their allies were in the most basic way, to see that there were people like them upon whom they could rely, and their names offered them a daily reminder of their history. They knew the covenant that they were expected to uphold as children of Abraham and Sarah. The story of their ancestors gave them perspective and a prophecy of a better time to come. And their belief in that time to come was enacted by bestowing those same names to future generations who would one day carry that story into redemption. So it is for us. We've doubled down on things we know to be true. We've held on to who we are and what we believe, and maybe we've even learned things anew. And though it's scary to see what happened this week, we can find inspiration in who we've been and what we've learned, with faith that we're not only heading into a better place, but that the muscles that we've toned will help us get there. Parashat Shemot is only the beginning of Exodus, and the road to liberation extends far beyond it. Here, in Exodus 5, we read of Moses encountering Pharaoh for the first time to make his famous demand of letting God's people go. The Israelites' freedom is inevitable and fast approaching, but in this early moment of transition, Pharaoh digs in his heels and instructs his henchmen to make life worse for the Israelites. They double the workload of the slaves and make freedom the furthest thing from their minds. Seeing this violence and Pharaoh's behavior, Moses at first grows desperate. He returns to God and asks why God would have done this, if all that resulted was more pain and violence upon the people. At which point God replies, "You shall soon see what I do to Pharaoh. He shall let them go because of a greater might, because of a might greater than he." These are the words with which Parashat Shemot ends. There is a might greater than Pharaoh, even if it doesn't feel that way to either him or to Moses in that moment. We'll wait for future weeks and future Torah portions to finish the story, but we already know how it ends. And though this week was scary, and though we saw things that were so disturbing in the history of this nation, we also know that we're prepared for something beyond the last 4 years. Our present moment is filled with so much more hope than when we read this Parsha in 2017. Since then, we've seen the scourge of American white supremacy in full force. We've seen the worst xenophobic elements in our society and countless fissures between Americans. Those things were always there, but we've been able to see them in a new way. And at the same time, we've honed our tools for dealing with them. We've committed to doing better, to building power, to constructing a better world to come. We will one day have many consecutive Shabbats where we don't feel completely exhausted going into them. And because of the work that we have done, seeing truths and becoming better, we will make it so. Shabbat Shalom.